This is the Good Morning ISLA 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamic history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Welcome everyone to this new episode of the Good Morning ISLA 200 podcast. My name is Sasha. I'll be your host today, and I am joined by Sofia, Maya, Lake, and Alyna to talk about the representation of Muslim women in our society. Our goal will be to talk you through the most prevalent misconceptions surrounding their relation to Islam and how it impacts their lives in our contemporary environment. As we'll discuss this issue, I want to engage you to do an exercise that I know is much easier said than done, but one that's necessary, and that is to question your perception of certain people and try to determine how you came to this representation. I am asking you today to deconstruct the characteristics you believe true about them. This is crucial to understanding Muslim women's reality, because it allows us to grasp the multiplicity of factors that shaped a somewhat very untrue and globalized perception of how they lived before and live today. Let's dive right in. What is the most common representation of Muslim women? I think we can all agree that a standard media consumer without any knowledge of the situation will most likely picture a veiled woman, somehow under the influence of her family or husband, and marginalized from the professional world. I might be exaggerating a little here, but this idea of a passive attitude and victimization are essentially the characteristics emphasized by mass media in their representation of Muslim women. I want to suggest that it is partly the result of a lack of education. People make assumptions about subjects they don't know, and that is natural. But it becomes a problem when they take these first assumptions as the ultimate truth without informing themselves. This is exactly what is happening in our societies. Most people don't know anything about the construction of Islam as a religion, which strongly impacts their representation of Islamic culture as a whole. I want to mention that our discussion is based on various newspaper articles, which reflect the different and most prevalent misconceptions about Islam. Sharia law is a compelling example, as it bears a strongly negative connotation in most minds today, and Sofia is here to discuss this with us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. So how do you believe the interpretation of Sharia law has been misinformed in Western society?
Well, firstly, I'd like to start off by saying I think in contemporary Western society, the discourse surrounding the Middle East, the religion of Islam, and Muslim women has been obstructed by negative stereotypes and misconceptions due to a lack of information and education on said topic. There is this common conception that Sharia law imposes harsh punishments and that the laws that are imposed are strict, unjust, and static. Here in Western society especially, we see Sharia law being misrepresented, becoming surrounded by these false narratives, especially regarding the relationship between Sharia law and Muslimism. Muslim women are often perceived as victims in modern society, that they are oppressed by Sharia law. I think to truly debunk this misconception regarding the interconnectedness of the two, we must first debunk the misconceptions of each separately. In contemporary discussions surrounding Sharia law in the West, arguments often revolve around the evidence from countries that claim to be governed by Sharia law, such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. These countries have frequently appeared in Western headlines due to human rights violations, assertive foreign policy, and strict corrupt government regimes. Therefore, since all these countries publicly claim their state is ruled under Sharia law has gained a negative reputation in the West. However, it would be misinformed to solely form an opinion on Sharia law based on how certain countries in the Middle East implement it in their government. To fully form an opinion on Sharia law, it is essential to first establish a proper definition of the term before applying it to contemporary society, particularly before applying it to Western contexts. Sharia law, referring to Islamic law, includes legal Islamic traditions as well as revelations from the Quran. It is described as being a way of living in society, as all-encompassing. Contrary to common belief, Islamic law is not static. There is no book of codes and laws outlining how to legally live your life. I think a lot of the time there is this conception that the Quran is the book of Islamic law. Instead, the topic of Islamic law and what it is constantly being debated because it's constantly being interpreted interpreted and applied in different ways. Qadi, known as judges in English, as well as muftis, who are legal experts that people go to when they have a legal question or problem, interpret Sharia law and apply it to modern contexts. So this modern misconception that Sharia law is strict and creates fixed punishments derived from Sharia law cannot be completely true. A big misconception that arises from Sharia law in the West is when you reference Sharia law with regard to modern states that claim to practice Sharia law. In Wael B. Halak's book, An Introduction to Islamic Law, their argument is presented that modern Sharia states are not actually a true representation of Sharia law because political leaders implement their own interests into the interpretation of Sharia law to either politically or economically benefit from it. However, whether people believe Halak's argument to be true or not, it is true that Sharia law can be interpreted differently. Every state, every culture, and every human can develop a different way to live by Sharia law. Therefore, leaders of states can spin Sharia law to their own benefit. Whether modern state leaders do this or not is up for debate.
And now that you established what Islamic law truly is, can you expand on how the Western perspective on Sharia law impacts specifically Muslim women?
Yes, of course. Now that we have distinguished Sharia law from interpretations of Sharia law by modern states, we can start to debunk common conceptions of the relationship between Sharia law and Muslim women. Over the last several years in Western society, especially in Western media, Muslim women have been represented as oppressed by the laws of Sharia. There is this common idea that they are victims of a repressive legal system. For example, during President George W. Bush's War on Terror, one of the Bush administration's publicized reasons for the invasion was that there was a women's crisis going on in Afghanistan, and they needed help from their oppressor. This discourse surrounding these common themes is that Sharia law was too repressive. However, going back to this idea of Sharia law and the way that modern states interpret and apply Sharia law, I believe it can clear up a few misconceptions. The way states interpret Sharia law should not be reflected back onto Islamic law. It should only reflect the people who interpret it. Therefore, in the context of state leaders, if state leaders or groups in power such as the Taliban impose strict laws against women, this does not mean the whole Islamic legal system agrees with it. We can further see that women are not inherently repressed by Sharia law, as they historically have been a part of judicial systems, in which they played the roles of judges.
There are indeed many women who have actively shaped Islam as a religious, cultural, and a social framework. But these narratives are still widely excluded from public discussions and mass media. And when they are discussed, even in scholarly studies, it is still done with strong biases, which fails to give an accurate account of Muslim women in Islamic history. Maya here will add to this discussion through the analysis of two important female figures within Islam. A lot of us know about Al-Khansa, who is an incredibly famous woman poet from pre-Islamic Arabia. She's often considered one of the greatest female poets in Islamic history. Specifically, Al-Khansa wrote Hadiths, which is a genre of poetry dedicated to mourning men that go to war.
Hi, yes, I'd be glad to talk about Al-Khansa because she's a really intriguing figure when talking about Islamic women, because there's so many different interpretations of her. As you said, she's an incredibly well-known and celebrated as an excellent female poet. However, because of the large amount of praise she receives, she's often described as an exception to the rule when it comes to Arabic women. Instead of depicting her as the best of many women poets, she's described as the only good example of a woman poet, which really gives off the idea that other Arabic women were not as smart or capable of being exceptional. On the other hand, Western standards of beauty are often projected onto her. There's this idea that she succeeded despite her nose. However, within the Islamic tradition, she was actually renowned for having a beautiful nose. Even mentioning Al-Khansa's beauty, or lack thereof, tells a lot about the double standard women are put up against.
That's true. We don't often hear men's appearances being an important factor in their work.
Exactly. In addition, there's also discourse concerning Al-Khansa that serve to reinforce stereotypes of women as frail and emotional. Because as you mentioned, she mainly wrote poems mourning her brother. This interpretation really serves to solidify stereotypes of the oppressed Arabic women that we see way too much. However, What happens with these types of interpretations is that the cultural context within which Al-Khansa was writing her poems isn't taken into account. Actually, Rithas were simply the type of poems women were supposed to write at the time. Take it as a job. It wasn't necessarily because they spent all their time weeping. I think there's often this tendency to project what the right way of embodying feminism is, which tends to disregard context. We impose a certain way of doing feminism or of being a liberated woman.
Yes, you are totally right. And I was thinking, since the Quran is such an important book, do you have anything to mention about how the Quran influences people's perception of women?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, Alyna Mankani would be really relevant to talk about here. She is a scholar that was really dedicated to challenging the assumptions that the Quran is a text that excludes women. A big point that she makes is that Arabic is a gendered language. That might make it seem as though teachings of the Quran are only aiming at men. However, she argues that usage of the masculine plural form actually is a gender-neutral term that encompasses men and women, unless otherwise stated.
Yes, that idea of gendered grammar is the same as in French, where the masculine plural form doesn't necessarily exclude women.
Exactly. In addition, what it stresses is that the Quran is a fundamentally universal text that applies to all people. Therefore, an interpretation of the Quran, which is done in one singular way, for example, where Quran is assumed to be exclusionary to women, pretty much goes against the claim that the Quran is universal and flexible within time and space. She also explains how it's the perception of women that already exists in the world that influences the interpretations of the Quran's position on women. She tries to look past preconceptions people may have when reading the Quran that may affect how they interpret the text. She looks at the Quran at the level of grammar and in a really objective way.
That is really interesting. We can also include tafsir into the discussion. Tafsir, for those who might not be familiar, is an interpretation of the Quran, which comes in different versions by different people.
Absolutely. Actually, she mentions that tafsir were always written by men. Therefore, women were most of the time written about through the lens of men, which may not have been an accurate representation of how women lived and perceived themselves at the time. Wadid does so much analysis and argumentation defending the equality between men and women. So keep in mind that what I mentioned today is only a small part of her work.
Thank you so much for this clarification. And lastly, I would love to hear about a specific work that you found relevant in adding to the conversation.
Yes, of course. I'd love to touch on a book called 3 Centuries of Travel Writing by Muslim Women, which I believe serves as a refreshing way to perceive women within Islam. Usually in the West, when we think of travel and travel writing, we think of ideas of liberation, freedom, independence, and exploration of the world. And in fact, usually this genre of writing is attributed to men. Or when it is attributed to women, it's usually about the masculine, rebellious woman. We've talked about it a lot, but we've truly been conditioned to think that Muslim women are repressed women who don't have anything to do with the ideas of freedom and independence. So unfortunately, we tend to exclude them from travel writing. Without going into specifics, this book is great for showing readers that Muslim women did have agency, that they traveled, and that there were many different types of Muslim women. It shows that overall, Islam and the women within it are not monolithic. However, when reading it, it's still important to keep in mind that women travelers were usually from wealthy backgrounds and that stories from other women aren't necessarily included in these collections of stories. In addition, we should remember that through the translation of these stories, new meanings may have arisen, and certain word choices might reflect Orientalist conceptions of Islamic women as somehow exotic and mysterious and alluring. The concept of mysticism actually is often brought up in the translation of these stories.
Thank you so much, Maya. And I definitely think that one of the things to take away from your points is that we need to avoid projecting our modern biases about what it is to be a free woman in today's society.
Yes, and I think that it's really important to be conscious of the time, place, and culture within which works are produced. In addition, it's crucial to keep in mind that the translations we read in English are inevitably modified versions of original texts, which may contain biases of their own. And always remember that what you receive as translated information is only a part of the whole story.
Yes, because a lot of works from women, mainly those who weren't literate or from the lower classes of society, were often oral and therefore may not have been preserved throughout the years. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to learn more about Muslim women's work and their significance, which, as we mentioned, is far too often overlooked, giving the idea that women are marginalized from Islamic productions. It has become very common to hear demonizations of Islam as a sexist religion that inherently exclude women from all kinds of positions. But an accurate analysis and understanding of the sacred texts actually contradicts this misconception. Fatima Marnisi dedicated herself to this project, which Lake will describe much better than me now.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so happy to share a little bit about Fatima Marnisi and what she says on the Hadith. In her book, The Veil and the Male Elite, Marnisi essentially scrutinizes the usage of Hadith in restricting women from entering the political sphere. I think that within a dominant narrative, there's this idea that the woman's role in society is in a household and not necessarily in politics or governance. And this idea is very much supported by the Hadith. There's a transcription that's purportedly from the Prophet Muhammad that reads, and I quote, "Those who entrust their affairs to a woman will never know prosperity." And despite a very rigorous process for the transcription and production of Hadith, Marnisi raises the concern of the possibility of falsely fabricated Hadith, or Hadith that may be transcribed under the influence of personal motivations by the transmitter rather than the true words of the Prophet. It's really important to remember that these Hadith cannot necessarily be taken at face value. At the end of the day, the transmitters of Hadith are human, they are fallible and susceptible to personal incentives that may influence them to recall Hadith in a certain way that might be advantageous to themselves rather than the true words of the Prophet. In the case of the Hadith, those who entrust their affairs to a woman will never know prosperity. It's really quite telling that the transmitter, Abu Bakr, recalled the Hadith 25 years after the Prophet is said to have delivered those lines. And Marnisi says that the particular period during which he recalled this Hadith is actually quite opportune, as it happens right after the Battle of the Camel. At the time, Aisha had just been politically wiped out, with 1,300 of her supporters fallen at the battle. And though Aisha had asked very prominent elite men to join her clan in battle, many like Abu Bakr, who I should comment is her own father, refused to join. So in this sense, by recalling the Hadith at this time, it gave Bakr a means to justify his own actions as to why he refused to join Aisha in the civil war. Essentially, this Hadith was a scapegoat that excused men from joining Aisha's clan due to the fact that Aisha was a woman, and according to the Hadith, the affairs cannot be entrusted to a woman. So, therefore, a woman like Aisha cannot be entrusted to lead a political affair like a war. And this idea of Abu Bakr as an unreliable transmitter is further supported by the fact that he had previously actually been punished for transmitting false testimonies. By understanding the context surrounding this hadith, we can begin to deconstruct this hadith and how it has essentially been weaponized for misogyny and a means to exclude women from spheres of power.
You say that this hadith perpetuates misogyny. Can you explain a little bit how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the line is pretty damning in itself in terms of barring women from leadership. The hadith essentially perpetuates an understanding within the Muslim community that they should not allow women into spheres of leadership or power because it will inevitably lead to failure. And not only does this, I think, hurt the freedom of Muslim women within the religion and their political participation, but it also contributes to the dominant mainstream perceptions, understanding of Muslim women as oppressed people who are, confined to certain spaces of society, such as domestic spheres, rather than public spaces of leadership, for example. And for this reason, the dissemination of this hadith can be harmful in a lot of ways. It can perpetuate a lot of misconception for outsiders through religion. Already in the West, there's this societal narrative associated with Muslim women that their religion is very backwards and inherently constrains them from enjoying the envisioned freedoms that Western secular women are thought to have. For example, the freedom of their clothing or occupation and just mobility in general. And we know from reading the Quran that that's not the case. The Quran is full of female leaders like Aisha who led wars and were entrepreneurs. However, this particular hadith and the ways it's been culturally weaponized and interpreted against women essentially fuel the Western argument that Muslim women are oppressed.
We cannot stress enough the necessity of understanding the political and social context of Islamic faith and its development. And I really thank our three speakers for providing us with the tools to truly understand the role and work of women in Islam. The fact remains, though, that most people don't know anything about the construction of Islam as a religion, which strongly impacts their representation of Islamic culture. And rather than informing themselves, they will take their experiences and cultural model and apply it to an entirely different context. Unfortunately, this is true even for social justice movements. Feminists, for example, could be expected to try and challenge this representation, but they end up most of the time reproducing it because they apply the Western context and their most often liberal values to a different cultural situation. Let me explain this. What we know in North America is a history of secularism, where religion has lost more and more influence over time, and is now considered by most a part of the private sphere of individuals. However, Islam is essentially different because it guides Muslims in all aspects of their lives, and provides not only an individual, but also a social guidance. The Western private versus public distinction doesn't make sense in the Islamic framework. This tendency to impose one's culture and values on someone else is the reason for the never-ending debate around the hijab. It has become synonym of oppression, in spite of the fact that most covered Muslim women explain that it's a profoundly personal decision that reflects their identity and how they want to express it. But because Western feminism has developed differently, most feminists refuse to believe that modesty gives Muslim women agency and that the hijab is in no way a measure of a woman's emancipation. But because it is considered as such, it has been politicized beyond measure, and we can witness the impact of this politicization in our very own province with the recent enactment of Bill 21, which Alyna will talk us through now. So, can you explain this bill to our audience?
Absolutely. So, Bill 21 is a law that was passed in Quebec, Canada in June 2019. The law is officially titled An Act Respecting the Laicity of the State, and it was passed with the view that it would work to align public policy with the government's view of a secular state, which is the separation of religion from the affairs of the state or government. And the law prohibits public service workers from wearing religious symbols such as hijabs, turbans, kippas, and crosses in the workplace, and it impacts several types of public service employees in positions of authority, such as teachers, judges, public prosecutors, and other such positions.
And can you explain how Bill 21 affects specifically Muslim women and their right to wear a hijab?
So, while Bill 21 restricts public service workers from wearing all religious symbols, it encounters substantial criticism for what many perceive as a direct infringement on women's rights, particularly affecting Muslim women. And a lot of critics have argued that the legislation, by restricting job opportunities for Muslim women who choose to wear hijabs, is inherently sexist and contradicts the core feminist principle of my body, my choice. And in 2022, lawyer Perry Revon brought attention to the fact that job losses under Bill 21 exclusively impacted Muslim women, notably at the largest French language school service center in Quebec, which is the Centre de Services Scolaires de Montréal. Every case related to the legislation was directly associated with the wearing of the hijab, and this emphasis on Muslim women's experiences underscores the broader concerns about the legislation's impact on religious freedom and gender equality. Furthermore, beyond restricting Muslim women from wearing hijabs, Bill 21 is expected to worsen social attitudes and prejudice towards Muslims in Quebec. Many argue that the legislation conveys a message of unequal respect for different faiths, assuming a negative view of religious practices. And this perspective excludes different certain groups solely based on their beliefs, hindering their full participation in state institutions. And despite its broad ban on religious symbols for specific public employees, the public often tends to link Bill 21 to Muslim women, particularly those who wear hijabs. And in an online survey of 1,828 participants from Muslim, Jewish, and Sikh communities, the negative impact of Bill 21 was evident, with Muslims, especially Muslim women, feeling the most affected. A significant 78% of surveyed Muslims felt a decreased sense of acceptance in Quebec society over the past 3 years, and prejudicial remarks were reported by 53%, unfair treatment by authority figures by 47%, and 2/3 of Muslim women claimed to have experienced or witnessed hate crimes. Safety concerns rose sharply, with 73% feeling less secure in public spaces, and the majority reported diminished hopefulness, reduced freedom of expression, and reluctance to engage in social and political life. And most strikingly, 83% of Muslim women expressed decreased confidence in their children's future since the enactment of Bill 21, highlighting the profound impact on this specific demographic.
That's very interesting. I can imagine that these consequences have triggered some kind of resistance. So are there any organizations or movements that oppose Bill 21?
Definitely. Some notable organizations against Bill 21 include the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the National Council of Canadian Muslims. The CCLA explicitly states on its website that many have reached out in outrage against Bill 21 and that the law has cost people their jobs and professions and disproportionately harms women, those from minority religions, racialized people, and immigrant communities, and therefore the CCLA remains committed to fighting Bill 21. And additionally, the NCCM also remains strong against Bill 21, stating that this discriminatory law is nothing less than a law that causes second-class citizenship in Canada, and has an ongoing petition to end Bill 21. And aside from these two organizations, the number of groups and protests against Bill 21 is enough to understand the impact it has on Muslims as well as other minority groups in Canada.
And to focus a little bit more on women's experience, are there some incidents of consequences Muslim women have had to face due to Bill 21?
There definitely have been, and while some Quebec government officials insist that Bill 21 does not play a part in infringing on Muslim women's rights and careers, many incidents have actually occurred since the bill passed, which might provide a different perspective. Some notable incidents include the cases involving Fatima Anvari and Amira Alagwabi. The case of Fatima Anvari particularly became the face of the 2019 law when the popular third-grade teacher was removed from the classroom and reassigned to another role because she wears a hijab, which was in violation of the provincial law. And hearing this news, thousands came out to protest Bill 21, including mayors of big cities outside of Quebec. However, on the other hand, some Quebec government representatives defended the law, stating that Fatima Anvari shouldn't have been hired in the first place. Another popular incident involved Amira Alagwabi, former special representative on combating Islamophobia for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who faced criticism in January 2023 for highlighting a rise in anti-Muslim sentiments in Quebec. In a 2019 column she co-authored, Al-Agwabi referenced a poll indicating that 88% of Quebecers with negative views of Islam supported the ban on religious symbols for public school teachers. In response, her opponents scrutinized her articles and social media posts from her time as a journalist and activist, distorting her points on discrimination and colonialism. One instance involved Al-Agwabi expressing disgust on Twitter after a scholar suggested that French Canadians were the largest group victimized by British colonialism, urging recognition alongside Indigenous people and other disadvantaged groups. Despite apologies, Al-Agwabi faced condemnation, raising questions about double standards compared to other cases. For instance, in fall 2022, then Immigration Minister Jean Boulet made controversial remarks about how 80% of immigrants go to Montreal, don't work, don't speak French, which was widely condemned across the political spectrum and Quebec society. But he did not face similar consequences. He issued an apology, was re-elected, and appointed as the Minister of Labor. And so these incidents and many others highlight challenges Muslim women face due to Bill 21, raising concerns about their rights and freedom as Canadian citizens, and revealing apparent inconsistencies in handling controversies.
Thank you so much, Alyna. This concludes our discussion today. I hope we were able with this episode, thanks to our wonderful speakers, to make you rethink your conception of Muslim women while targeting the main misconceptions surrounding them. From the history of Sharia law to the various impactful female figures in Islam and the Quran itself, our aim was to bring to light Muslim women's agency in their religious framework. Agency that has been denied by the Western representations for far too long. Beyond that, we want you to take away a certain idea of prudence and critical skills when it comes to conceptualizing minority groups. Fighting our tendency to apply our cultural model to everyone else is a daily and crucial exercise. However, before we leave, I would like to add a final nuance to our discussion. We might have focused today on debunking the commonly believed oppression of Muslim women, but in no case do we diminish the oppressive experiences of women currently living under harsh extremist Islamic regimes. These women resist every day against their current situation, and whereas women in Montreal fight for the right to wear the hijab, they fight for the right not to wear it. Different women have various ways of relating to Islam, and it is not our position in Western society to determine for them which way of expressing their identity reflect their agency. On this note, I thank again Sofia, Maya, Lake, and Alyna, as well as our listeners. Goodbye, and until next time on the Good Morning ISLA 200 podcast.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.